Thank you so much, Melissa, for that. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate you also recognizing that today is 9/11 because it is an important day. And I remember, in our nation's history, we used to always take a moment of silence to recognize this day. If it's okay, I'd like to do that just for maybe 15 seconds for this day. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. All right, so let's kick it off. So I'm going to share my slides with everyone. I'm assuming everyone can see this. If Okay, thank you, Chelsea, for the head nod. I appreciate it. So we're going to be talking about the cycle that I have seen over and over again in pretty much every client that I have coached. I feel like it is part of the human experience, the cycle that we get stuck in. I call it the overthinking, which leads to anxiety, which then leads to procrastination, and then you kind of just get stuck. And then you kind of like loop over and over again. If this seems familiar, if you've ever felt this, please let me know in the chat. I'm curious, like how many of you here have experienced this? Okay. This is a little bit about me. I'm not going to go over who I am since you just heard all about it. The one thing I'll add is that I'm a coach at Affinity Consulting and Lawyerist Lab, and we do both executive coaching as well as small business coaching. So we offer both for a variety of types of businesses and leaders within businesses. Okay, see in the chat, a lot of people are coming through. Yes, yes, yes. Overthinking every day. Okay, if it's every day, then today will be really helpful for you. So what we're going to be talking about really three different things. The first thing I want to talk about is the science, because once we understand the science, you'll really understand what's occurring at a deep level in your mind and your body. So you're going to learn the mechanics of basically emotional dysregulation, which is the crux of why we have this, as well as regulation, which is really the secret to overcoming this cycle. The next thing we're going to learn about is triggers. So how do you identify your triggers? And then you're also going to learn some exercises to learn how to shift those responses so that you can get back to a place of focus and homeostasis in your body. The third thing we're going to talk about is how do you put this into action long-term for yourself? So it's great to learn the tools today, but we want to make this a sustainable practice that you take with you from here on out. So you're going to learn how to create an action plan and establish keystone habits to reinforce these new behaviors you're learning. Okay, so the cycle itself is something that I want to talk about. It's the, as I said, I call it the overthinking, anxiety, procrastination cycle. And it really is a self-perpetuating loop that just keeps going over and over again. It begins with the first step, which is overthinking. And that is really important to recognize that it starts with the act of overthinking and too much analysis. Analysis paralysis, another way of thinking about it. And this is really where the mind becomes trapped in its endless analysis. You feel like the analysis is really critical before moving to the next step of action. So you're getting stuck in analysis. It's important to recognize. Once that happens, and this mental overload occurs because you're analyzing so much, you literally have so much cognitive load at a neural level that triggers anxiety because now you're literally overwhelmed. Just like if you're like, let's say exercising, if you put too much weight on your body from exercising, you would feel overwhelmed. So that's literally what's happening, but it's happening at a cognitive level instead of, through your muscles. And that triggers the anxiety. And that anxiety is really uncertainty and it's fear of making the wrong decision. So what's happening here is now we're going from overthinking, like too much analysis, to now like, I'm afraid of making the wrong choice. Again, it's important for us to recognize that they're two different things, they're not one and the same. We often feel like they're the same, but they're two different steps. And then the third step is as anxiety begins to build, then we actually get into solid state of procrastination because what happens here is we're trying to avoid the discomfort of the task itself and the previous two stages that we've experienced. And this avoidance overall just leads to more overthinking, more anxiety, more procrastination. And that unfinished task just becomes larger and larger as the deadline approaches, as other people that may be involved need you. And the anxiety intensifies. So it just deepens the entire cycle. At its core, this entire cycle is rooted in the body trying to preserve itself. It's the biological need of self-preservation, of this instinct of, I don't want to have too much mental overload. I don't want to have the fear. These are the underlying currents that are occurring at a mental and somatic level, and the body's trying to preserve itself, which is why you're experiencing what you're experiencing. The nervous system believes that there's a real threat and a real danger in your environment through completing of this task, which is why this happens. So while the intention of the body is to avoid harm, it's actually preventing the action that you want to, which might create harm in your life professionally. So it's important for us to understand the self-preservation is what's occurring. Does that make sense to everyone? If it makes sense, let me know in the chat as well, or if you have any questions. I should also add, at any point in time, if you have any questions or thoughts, please let me know. I would love for this to be interactive so that this information makes sense and is really applicable to your daily lives. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is the science of why we do what we do today. So the science that the majority of us are leveraging to make decisions and how we work professionally and how we approach leadership is based on very, very outdated science. It's really coming from the 1980s, which even for me, sometimes hard to recognize, that was 40 years ago. It wasn't like, it feels like it wasn't that long ago, but that was a really, really long time ago. Oh, Judy's just asking if the slide deck will be available to us. I can make it available. I'm not sure what our stance is here at Lemonade, but I'm happy to share it if you'd like, Judy, and everyone else. So this science that was developed in the past, in the 1980s is when management and consulting and coaching really blew up. Like Tony Robbins, if you've ever heard of him, became very popular in the 80s because when management leadership took on a new turn. And that's when we started talking about more discipline, more willpower, work hard, just force and push our way to success. There was like idea of like the ethos of you just have to work hard, pull yourself up from the bootstraps, and things are going to work out. That's all you have to do. And that's what we thought at the time is how people work and how we create success. But that work ethic from the 80s is no longer applicable today because we know that that was an oversimplification of what is occurring. And at that time, our science as a whole, the medical world, was very much focused on cognitive function. Today, it has shifted, and we recognize that the mind and the body work together. And biologically, there's a lot occurring at a somatic level. So we can't ignore the body. It's not just about the psychology, it's also about the biology. And that is a whole other animal, literally, because your body is very much, and it's part of the animal kingdom. There's a lot of things occurring, which we're going to talk about. So at the cognitive level, we know that there are neural pathways, but we've discovered is there's somatic pathways in the body as well, which is distinct from the pathways in the brain. And that's how we are making decisions as together. So there are somatic impulses occurring at the same time that we need to understand and work through. So at the root of this overthinking, we have something called task paralysis. So task paralysis is it's actually a scientific term, so you can look it up. There's a lot of research and literature about it, which is very, very fascinating. But one of the things that's interesting to note is that task paralysis is when something feels difficult, it's actually quite simple. So an example that I like to give is, let's say you have an Amazon return. This is great because Debbie was talking about Amazon. How many of you have ever had an Amazon return that you actually do not return and you miss that window and then you lose out on that return savings? It's a product you don't want. You want your money back, but then you don't actually do the return, right? It's such a simple thing. Just go drop it off at Whole Foods or FedEx or USPS or wherever it is, but we don't do it. It's so simple. And this is occurring at the biological level. So logically, we know it's easy, but biologically, it feels hard. So that distinction, again, is I'm harping on this because it's so important for us to know. So logically, there's negative consequences, but you remain like frozen, like this invisible wall that's blocking you. Okay, Elena said, my husband drives me crazy with that. He does not like returning things. Elena, hopefully you're the returner in the family so you can help your husband out. Alyssa is saying, oh, I am. Okay, good. I need somebody like that in my household. We don't have one. Alyssa is saying, yes, some of you may remember my horse costume from Annual Conference. I own that now. Yeah, okay. Thank you for sharing, everyone. So, this freeze response that is happening in our body is because, again, we're thinking there's a threat that's occurring. It's your survival mechanism that has just like really just gone awry. And the way the survival response occurs in the body is something called the polyvagal ladder. So I'm sure everyone is here has heard of the fight or flight state, but that's only one of three distinct stages that the body goes through, and it's called the polyvagal ladder. So there are three states we're always in, and we're cycling in and out of these three just depending on what's occurring. And sometimes we get stuck in one of these stages. So one stage, which is the red stage, is the freeze stage. This is the dorsal vagal response. So this is your entire nervous system just literally shutting down. And this occurs when we encounter basically something unresolved at a deep level of emotion. And now we're stuck, as we've talked about with the task paralysis, as well as just this overthinking cycle. The other state that we can experience is the fight or flight. Now, this occurs when we feel there's an intense danger at a subconscious level or a real danger, like a tiger in your face, if we were back, thousands of years ago on planet Earth. And this also leads to the protection. The third stage is a social engagement stage. This is a stage we want to be in as much as possible. This is where we feel calm, we're settled, we feel curious, our hearts are open, we're compassionate, we're mindful, we're aware of everyone around us. And this is where we want to be. But we get stuck in these other two stages. Melissa, you wrote, my husband says I am fight or fight, not flight. Yeah. And that is common. So depending on how we resolve things when we're younger, we have these somatic pathways of either being more flighty or being more fighty. It is very common because what helped you survive before. So instinctively through the pathways that if I fight, I know I'm going to get my outcome. And if I run away from it, I'm not. So that's maybe why for you specifically, it is that way. And thank you for sharing. So these are the three stages that we go through. And this, again, is a very natural cycle. We're always going through it throughout our days, our weeks, our months, and whatnot. But what's happening with the overthinking is this feedback loop, it just gets stuck. So when we're in the sympathetic, which is this, when we're going from the trigger to the non-trigger, your body is just overwhelmed. So when it is stuck in this stage of fight or flight, the body is thinking it is dying. So it wants to conserve energy because, again, you're being overloaded by all of the cognitive stuff. So your brain is thinking, I need to conserve energy, which is why I'm now going to move into the next into the stage. But if I want to get out of it, then I need to start getting into action. So I'm just going to go back to this for a second. If you're in the freeze stage, to move out of freeze, we actually need to go to fight or flight, not social engagement. So typically, I think, the common understanding is if you're not feeling good in your mind or your body, then you want to do something to feel good. So let's say I feel maybe like lethargic, I feel lazy, then maybe somebody would give me the advice, maybe you should meditate, right? Like meditate or do some nice, calm breathing. That'll settle you down and then you can do the task you have to do. But that's actually the wrong response because that is social. That's very subtle. It's very calm. Your body needs to go to fight or flight before it can move to social engagement. It has to. So you actually need to get physically active, for example, which is the fight or the flight. So your body knows this. So instinctively, when it's in the frozen stage, when it's thinking, I need to conserve all of this energy, my mental energy and physical energy, because I think my body is going to die, then it thinks, oh, I'm going to die. So I need to create some action. So in order to create some action, it begins thinking. So that's the overthinking. So now it goes to fight or flight. That fighting is that overthinking. It's creating mental activity to stay alive. And then it's thinking, oh, but now it's too much. It's too much activity. I think I'm going to die again because too much energy. So I'm going to go back to freeze stage. So the body is doing this feedback looping of going back and forth for the purpose of just staying alive. So that's, again, important for us to know. That's what's occurring. So just going back and forth. It's trying to conserve energy, and then it's trying to get back into action. And we need to break this loop. So as I mentioned earlier, we have all of these pathways in the body, right? We have the neural pathways, but we also have the somatic pathways. Now, these pathways that you have weren't created during your adult life. They're actually created when you're a child. The majority of our neural pathways and somatic pathways are created before the age of 7. And that's because of the way our brain is formed. When we're born, we have literally every pathway available to us as a child, as a baby, which is why babies can learn any language, right? As you get older, it gets harder. That's why a baby can be good at any activity, a music, a craft, whatever it is, and whatever they're given, they blossom in over time. So when we're babies, we have all pathways available, but depending on what we're doing, more pathways get cemented, and the ones that aren't being used basically deteriorate and they go away, they dissolve. So now we get stronger and stronger pathways. So the pathways are again both cognitive, but they're also somatic. So for example, giving that example, earlier when Melissa was saying I'm, more fighty, my husband thinks I'm more fighty, it's because maybe as a child, that's what got you to your outcome of feeling good, right? The social engagement stage. So that's what you're doing over and over again. So for somebody else, it might be something different. So in the body, we have these pathways. So it's important because there are a lot of emotions that we were never allowed to feel. And some of this is gendered as well. So one example that I like to give is for the science shows actually for men, the primary emotion that they weren't allowed to feel when they were young boys is anger. And for women, it was shame. It's not socially acceptable to feel these things. And because we weren't allowed to feel it, we suppressed it and created a secondary emotion on top of this to feel. So for example, going to that example of shame, so I know for many women, when we were girls, we were told to do something that maybe like give a hug to an uncle that was creepy. Okay, Chelsea nodded her head. So I think there's lots of people here in this call who may be familiar with that specific feeling. So you maybe you felt that discomfort, but you still did the activity that you were asked by your family. So you were never allowed to experience that discomfort that you had. And because of it, you've been carrying it around your whole life. But you did feel something else. You felt a protective emotion instead. Maybe it was a feeling of acceptance, love. I'm not really sure what was occurring for all of us at that moment in time, but there was another emotion that the brain said, this is okay to feel. It's safe to feel, right? It's social safety, which is still important because social approval of the community, approval of our tribe is part of survival. So we created a secondary emotion. So we never allowed ourselves to feel that first emotion. So now the body is stuck, right? It's stuck in that emotion at a somatic level, not a cognitive level. And we have to actually resolve this emotion, whatever it is, to stop the overthinking cycle. I know it seems odd, but the reason we're procrastinating is because there's some unresolved emotion that we're not actually allowed to feel. Does that make sense? Let me know in the chat if this makes sense. I know it's kind of complex and not something that we typically talk about in society. Okay, while we're waiting for those to come in, one thing I want to mention is procrastination is a symptom, not a cause. So I feel often in society, we think, let's fix the procrastination, but that's a symptom, not the cause, right? Which is very, very different. We have to understand what the cause is. If you treat the symptom, then you're just managing the symptom over and over again. You can't put a Band-Aid on, like a giant wound, like on your arm or your leg. That's not going to work. But it's what we're doing when we're trying to resolve procrastination through willpower and whatnot. We're just putting a Band-Aid on the problem over and over again. And that wound just keeps getting bigger and bigger. As you take on more cognitive load, it gets harder and harder over time. So why does this happen on a more, like going back to our work and our adult selves? There's a few different things. So the first is overscheduling. When we overschedule ourselves, we are literally creating too much cognitive load, right? So that is that task analysis paralysis, like too much analysis is happening, going back to how the cycle starts. So overscheduling is a primary driver that I see over and over again in my own clients. We often think that we are super people, we're supermen, superwomen, and we can do a lot of things and we can do them really, really fast. But the truth is that that's not true. Like we are humans. There are so many hours in the day that is these, guardrails exist for us. They're not imaginary. They're very real. So we have to keep that in mind. So one of the solutions for this is proper scoping. Well, this is what I recommend. So often people will think this activity will take 1 hour, but then it takes up 3 hours or even longer. There's other dependencies. It's important to figure out what are the dependencies and proper scoping. So what I recommend is just to like always scope properly, which just takes some time to think about, especially if you're working in a smaller business or part of a smaller team, then often you don't have the luxury of additional resources. So it becomes really, really important. So when we overschedule, we then trigger this built-in safety circuit of conserving energy. So we want to stop that cycle from starting. We want to stop that freezing from happening. The next thing that can happen is the stage of the sympathetic, which is a fight or flight. And that boils down to secondary emotions that I've talked about. So we really need to resolve the underlying emotions. The emotion landscape that we have is really like an iceberg. We have the surface layer of what we can see above the ocean, and that's the emotion that we're allowed to feel. And then below it is the rest of the iceberg. It's all of these other things that we never allowed ourselves to feel, and we have to allow ourselves to process it. So perfectionism, which is another big problem that I see specifically in the lawyer community, is rooted in fear of failure. It's rooted in fear. So the fears are a few, right? There's a fear of failure. There's a fear of I'm not going to measure up to peers. I'm not going to measure up to some standard that I have for myself, that I believe I need to have for myself, or the fear of judgment. So these are three fears, but there's others. As I mentioned earlier, the primary emotion for men is typically anger, and for women, it is shame. So those are the two core things to resolve. And this is something that has been written by psychologists over and over again. So it's not just like one study, but many, many, many studies have shown us that these are two really big emotions to resolve. So when we're able to resolve this, then we have access to all of the other emotions that we have as part of the human experience. I love this quote by Brené Brown that I wanted to share. Perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be your best. Perfectionism is the belief that if we live perfectly, look perfect, and act perfect, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. It's a shield. So I want to reread this, because perfectionism is the belief that if we live perfectly, if we do these things, then we can avoid all these other emotions. It goes back to exactly what we're saying, that, we're trying to avoid these emotions of that discomfort that we never felt. So perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the very thing that's preventing us from flight. Perfectionism is not the way. It is in the way. It is in the way. It's not the way. We often believe that, again, the harder we try, the more perfect we become, the more we will achieve. But in fact, it is the very thing that is blocking our success. It is the very fact, that thing that is creating the overthinking, that is creating the analysis that begins this whole stage. So it's really important for us to not try to be perfect, because it is literally preventing the action from taking place to begin with. So how do we begin this journey of working through our emotions, working through the overscheduling, like all of these things that's creating the problem? Step number one is awareness. So we want to identify the undercurrent of our experience, because right now we're only aware of what's happening at the conscious level. So we got to get to the undercurrent. So the first thing is to ask yourself, when you're experiencing an emotion in the moment, again, you're not, aware of these deeper emotions. You're just maybe frustrated. I can't get this thing done, or whatever the emotion is in the moment. Ask yourself, is this emotion about an emotion, or is it about an event? And what I mean by this is, if it's about an event, then that feeling you have is about the thing. So like just this morning, I was talking to a client who was very much frustrated by technology. There's a lot of things going wrong with technology, and he wasn't able to get this like marketing engine running because of tech problems that were occurring. So he was very, very frustrated, right? And we were talking about it. His frustration he felt was about the event. He's frustrated because the technology is not working, and he's having problems with the different people who are trying to get this together. So that's a true emotional response to that event. But if it's about an emotion, it would look a little bit different. So an example might be a person is in a meeting and it doesn't go well. Maybe let's say it's a presentation and the presentation doesn't go well. So the person who's doing it feels like upset, is like, this didn't go well, and walks out of it. It's just like, I wish I'd gotten better. These are all the different reasons it could have gotten better, running through the list in your mind of like, how could I improve? And then the next feeling is like, wow, I'm really like a horrible person. So there's this, negative cycle that's occurring of like low self-worth, essentially. So that emotion of low self-worth, of like, I'm a bad person, is about that emotion is an emotion about an emotion, right? The initial emotion was about the event, which was the meeting itself. Now he's making a meaning out of it. Now we're going to several different layers. So when you're experiencing an emotion in the moment, you have to ask yourself, is this an emotion about the event, Or am I making a meaning of it? Is an emotion about an emotion? Does that make sense? If that was clear, please let me know in the chat as well. Because I want to make sure that this piece is clear for everyone, because again, it's very, very important. Clear. Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate that. Awesome, Stacy. I appreciate that as well. Okay. The next question you want to ask yourself is, am I avoiding something? Anything. And often when we avoid something, we're also numbing, which is the next question you can ask yourself. Am I numbing? So if you're avoiding something, like I'm just not doing it, and you know when you're not doing something when you should be doing it, then you're in the flight stage, which means you are not in a responsive, social engagement stage for yourself. So you are in the flight stage. The third is if you're numbing, then you're in the freeze stage, because you can't even run away from the thing. You just need to be frozen. Then then this is what's occurring. The next thing you can ask yourself is, am I prioritizing somebody else's needs over my own in the moment? So another thing I often see as, many of us are parents of children who are maybe, in school, so they're younger, whether it's elementary or high school, and they need something. So sometimes we sacrifice our work to take care of them, or maybe it's another coworker that needs something. So if somebody else needs something, are you prioritizing their need over your own in this moment? Maybe you actually need to get this thing done because it's important to your financial survival, right? Like that's something that we don't also think about. It's important. So then you're fawning. So you're in the fawn stage. So these are some ways to identify, are you in the freeze? Are you in the flight? Are you in the fawn? And is this a true emotion? These are all things for you to ask yourself, then you know how to resolve it. The next thing you can do, let's say you ask yourself all these questions, you're like, I don't know. I just feel like crap. That's all I know, right? I just don't feel good. I don't know what I'm feeling. I just don't feel it. And I don't know what it is. If you're still confused, I have been there myself many times. Then the next thing you want to do is actually breathe into a sensation in your body, because you can't access it cognitively. So you have to work through it somatically. So what you want to do is in that moment, as you're feeling that emotion, again, you can't label it and identify it, which is fine. Then you do a scan of your body and you find a sensation. And I promise you, you will find a sensation. For somebody who hasn't done this before, you're like, I don't know if it's going to work. I 100% guarantee its work is based on science by lots of different people who specialize in somatic experiencing and somatic intelligence. There is a sensation there. There's always a physical sensation that's correlated to an emotion in your psyche. So as you just settle into your body, you'll find the sensation. So when you find that sensation, you just breathe into it. All you do is just sit there and you breathe and put your awareness on that sensation. And as you breathe into it over the course of a few minutes, let's say 10 minutes max, if it's, hard for you, maybe 2 minutes, if you're like adept at this and you do it often, then you'll find that emotion. So you identify what is that emotion that you're feeling. But that's not the true emotion. That's the cover, right? There's always that tip of the iceberg. So you keep breathing into it. And then you ask yourself, what is the feeling beneath the emotion? And then you find the true emotion. And then once you find that true emotion, then you can process through it and you will break through this block. Does that make sense? Okay. Really, through all of these questions or the somatic experiencing, what we want to identify is that secondary emotion. So once we have that emotion, great, now we know it, but we gotta shift it. It's not enough to just be aware of it, right? So awareness is step one. Step two is we have to actually process this emotion itself. So oftentimes my clients, what I see is awareness is usually enough. I would say like 70% of the times when I work with clients to help them identify this true emotion, just becoming aware of it is enough. They're like, oh, now I see it. It's so clear for me. Just that awareness automatically begins to change how they approach the problem. Well, so that is usually enough. But if it's not, then there are other things you can do. So the next thing is grounding. So grounding is literally being on the ground with your bare feet. So the science is fascinating on this. The level of like feel good chemicals that your body creates, like I'm having a brain fart right now. What are all those feel good chemicals? Like serotonin. Sorry, is like one of them. There's so many the chemicals that get created from dopamine. Thank you, Christine. I appreciate that. And dopamine from Susan as well. So these are things that we actually take pharmaceutical drugs for to change chemistry in our mind. But the act of grounding, of being in nature, creates those same chemicals, the same level as pharmaceutical drugs, the same level. It's really, really wild. So grounding is when you literally touch the earth. So you can touch it with your feet. If you do gardening, you can, garden with your hands. Walking in nature, your body begins to change. It creates these chemicals, which shifts the emotion. So whatever that negative emotion you're feeling, it will automatically shift to a positive one just by touching earth. So again, it has to be physical touch. So touching a tree or putting your feet on the earth itself. So that's one way. If you're nature centric, it's a great and easy tool to use. Just go outside, take your shoes off. The next thing you could do, which is also easy, something called vagal toning. So we have a nerve in our body called the vagus nerve, and it runs from our stomach to the brain. So it goes from the gut, which is responsible for a lot of our emotions as well. It actually gets created in the gut microbiome, which then affects the brain. So the nerve goes from the gut to the heart to the brain. But these three areas of our body is so central to emotional regulation. So by changing the vagus nerve, by toning it, you automatically change the somatic pathways that is then connected to the vagus nerve because of the other nerves that come out of it. And what toning is literally a vibration, and such a subtle vibration, which like from singing or humming. So if you just hum, like right now, if you're on mute, which everyone is, if you just hum, you'll notice there's a vibration in your body. And that vibration is actually toning that nerve. So you can shift an emotion by just humming. So simple. You can hum for again, anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes, and it'll start to shift it. You can also sing, and you can also use your breath, because all of this just creates a subtle vibration. And again, there's a lot of science behind this, which is really fascinating. There's like a subfield of coaching that is just focused on vagus nerve itself. There's so much literature on it, but it all boils down to just creating this vibration through sound, breath, singing. So another easy one you can do anytime. The next is to just challenge the belief that is behind the emotion. So emotions aren't independent. There's always a thought. Emotions and thoughts, they go together, right? All the time when we have an emotion, we're also thinking a thought. So figure out what is that thought that is behind the emotion, and then challenge it. Because most of the time that thought is what's called a limiting belief. It's actually not true. And you only know it's not true when you question it. So the example that I gave earlier of the gentleman who's giving a presentation that didn't go well for a work thing, and he was having these emotions about self-worth, if he sat there and questioned that belief, he would recognize that he in fact does a good job many times. And it was just this moment in time that it was not good. So it's not something about him, it's about the moment. So that's challenging the belief. So for yourself, whatever is occurring, I again guarantee when you identify that belief and ask yourself, is this actually true? You'll recognize that it's not true. And once you recognize it's not true, you will have new choices available to you. If this is like a real coaching session, if we're going through this, you'd automatically, see you have multiple choices. Oftentimes with clients, they can only see one path to whatever it is that they're trying to create. And when I question the thought that is behind it, automatically they're like, wait, there's like 10 other ways for me to do this. Why was I fixated on this one way? So you'll see this for yourself. You'll literally see new choices available when you question that belief. So identify the belief and question it. Okay, Dennis just shared something. The link was a Navy SEALs. Yeah, box breathing is very powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dennis. It's really, really powerful. There's many breath work. All of them will work for vagus nerve toning, but the box breath is really, really good for calming down. And it is used by the Navy SEALs in moments of high pressure, which is often for them.
Supriya, we also had a question from Amy. Where is the fawn stage located?
Oh, thanks for asking that. The fawn stage is part of, is it in here? I don't have it memorized myself. I apologize. I think it's part of fight or flight is the fawn stage, which is different than freeze because you're still doing something. Just not labeled on here. Did you have any other questions about the fawn stage? And if you do, just ask in the chat. I'm happy to answer it. Okay. The next thing, when this is the hardest of all of everything that I've described so far is pretty easy to do, right? The next one is to actually feel the emotion. And this is what we are all trying to avoid. So once you identify that emotion, just to sit there and feel it. It's going to be uncomfortable. You might cry. You might have all kinds of experiences, but you've got to feel it. You've got to feel it and actually just sit there until it runs its course. So you will feel that emotion and then it will go away. All emotions have a peak. It's like a belt, it's like a curve. And when you look at it on a chart, it starts off slow and then it peaks and it goes away. You have to recognize that emotions will go away and you are not the emotion itself. So you just have to sit there and feel it out. And part of that is doing it without judgment and doing it with mindfulness. So you want to watch, observe, and label what's coming up and remind yourself that you are not this emotion and is just a moment right now as part of your experience. It is part of the spectrum of being a human being. It is a part of all of the experiences that is possible for you, but is not who you are. Oftentimes, when we are in the emotion, we get stuck and we feel we are the emotion, but we're not. That's important. That's how you get to the other side, by recognizing that you are not it. So this is the steps. The last thing you can do is something called integrating inner conflicts. So this is a deeper layer when you're thinking part of like the psyche, that you can actually map it out to different levels. The final level is your values. So beneath emotions is values. So when two values are in conflict, you have all of these other emotions that come up, and that is a different way to tackle it. There's a very specific exercise I work my clients through, and if you'd like it, you can just send an email to me, supriya@lawyers.com, and I will send you the MP3 so you can listen to it on your own to resolve these inner conflicts that might occur. But that's the other way of shifting emotions. I'm just going to take a pause here. Does anybody have any questions on all of these different ways of shifting emotions? And feel free to come off mute as well, if you would like. Okay, I'm glad this was clear, because I know it was like the crux of the work itself. Would you share? Yeah, it's Chelsea. Maybe you can just type my email address in for Christine, who asked for it. Tracy, what is the fawn stage is essentially people pleasing. So fawn stage is when we prioritize somebody else's needs over our own. And people pleasing is how it often shows up in today's modern society. In the animal kingdom, the fawn stage, like this is all again part of the entire animal experience. You might see an animal just like lay down and try to be like a friend of the other animal. It does happen. We see in the animal kingdom. But for humans, it's people pleasing. Okay, so the next thing is, how do you identify your triggers, like that this is going to occur for you, right? Because we want to get ahead of it. We want to get ahead of the cycle before it starts. So the first thing is to audit your experience. So this is like something I often do with my clients when we first start working together, is to audit your schedule. So look back for the last 7 days. It's the easiest to do, not 30 days or more. And just look at, where did you start overthinking? Where did you start procrastinating? Where did this cycle occur for you? And as you look back the last 7 days, a pattern will begin to emerge. You'll see it's often this type of situation, this type of person, this time of day. These are the things, the context around it. You'll begin to see a pattern as long as you do this audit. And when you see that pattern, then you know how to prevent it, right, from occurring in the future. You identify what your issues were that created those patterns to begin with. The next is similar, is to audit your experiences for the future. So look at your calendar for the next 7 days coming forward, and then see where you think it's going to occur, and then mitigate those risks as well. The third, which is the most important, is to be here now, to look at the present moment. So as you're in the moment itself, identify those emotions and actually identify them and label them. Those are 3 ways of finding your trigger: looking at the past, the future, and the moment now, which is the present. Now we want to establish some habits, right? So how do we make sure that we are going to be working through this in the future so we're not getting stuck in the cycle? The first is honest scheduling and auditing. So honest scheduling, that scoping that I mentioned, is so, so critical, because as most leaders that I see, as they continue to rise, they put more on themselves thinking they can take on more. And it's just a thing that I see, especially with attorneys. So the honest scheduling, just getting really honest with yourself, like what is possible in the next 7 days, and just being aware of that. And then auditing your experiences and looking for the past as well as the future. The next is a regular reflection of your discomfort states. So what I recommend often when I'm working with clients is, as you're going throughout your day and you feel an emotion and you don't have time to work through it because you're working with your own clients or you're in the middle of a meeting, just make a note of it. And then at the end of the day or at the end of the week, revisit it and like, oh, what was that thing that I felt? So set aside some time, either daily or weekly. In the beginning, if you really want to do this work, it's going to be a daily practice. Like at the end of the day is what I recommend, just revisiting your emotions. And then after a while, it'll just become weekly, because you'll have worked through the big ones, and it becomes really small and easy after that. And then process those emotions with the different techniques that was discussed earlier. What you want to do is essentially increase what's called your window of tolerance, your distress tolerance. I'm just going to go ahead to the next slide to talk about this. So just like when we work out, if we have muscles, like when you first start going to the gym, let's say I haven't worked out ever and I'm trying to, lift weights with my arms, I can only do maybe 10 pounds, right? Because I'm new. I can't do 50 pounds. It's not possible. But over time, my muscles get stronger. Now I can lift more and more. My window of tolerance for what I can tolerate increases when I work on my muscles. The same thing is for your brain as well as your body. So you have to increase your window of tolerance by processing those emotions. That is the hard work. It's the equivalent of lifting weights because it's hard for your brain. So you have to increase it. So you don't want to be in hyperarousal or hypo. Hypo is more like freeze. Hyper is more like fight or flight. You want to be regulated, which is being in that green stage of social engagement. So you're able to feel okay with more and more discomfort. The only way to do this is to sit for longer periods of time or with more intense states. It's the same thing with working out. You're either doing more reps, right? Or doing a heavier load. It's the same thing for your brain. So it's the only way is to do the work itself. So sit with it. So that's one way. The other is to create these habits for yourself. So create accountability. So work with a coach, work with a friend, have an accountability buddy that you meet with on a regular basis to keep you accountable to increasing your habits as well as your, distress tolerance. The next thing to do is to create long-term reward pathways for your brain. So as I mentioned, we create these pathways. Now we can create them on purpose. These have been happening automatically. Your brain is automatically wired for two things. It's basically like a spectrum, and on it, there's pain and there's pleasure. We're always trying to go away from pain or go towards pleasure. Literally everything that we do in life, we think, again, we're analytical and intellectual, but we're just trying to get away from pain and go towards pleasure. Every action, every thought and feeling is towards this or that. So knowing this, you can use it for yourself. So if you want to do something, then you can create the pleasure or the pain. So, whatever the activity it is that you're trying to do let's say you're often stuck in procrastinating, let's say sending out invoice. That's one thing that I see often with clients who struggle with self-worth issues. They have trouble sending out invoices because it's asking for compensation and money. So for that, I often say, give yourself a reward. If I send out so many by a certain date, then I will reward myself with something nice, maybe a fancy bottle of wine, maybe a massage, maybe a road trip, something that's not too expensive or too time consuming, but it's a little bit extra than your regular life. So a little bit of a reward, a little bit of a pleasure, but something that gives you a little bit more, right? And then the opposite is you still have to create the pain. If I don't do this thing, then I have to punish myself. Maybe I will not. Let's say you watch a regular TV show, a series you enjoy. I'm not going to watch that show for 2 weeks, right? Just a little bit of pain, just something that takes away a pleasure that you already have in your life. We don't want to go extreme on these. Like you don't want to, like hit yourself or go on a 2-week vacation to Europe, right? Those are extremes. You just want to create a little bit of pleasure or a little bit of pain for the activity you're trying to accomplish. And this is creating new neural pathways. It's a rewards pathway is what it's called. That's how you do it. The next is just anticipating your triggers in advance and having anti-trigger solutions. So as we talked about earlier, there's all of these ways of shifting emotions. You discover for yourself, like what do you enjoy using? Which tool it works best for you? And then have the solutions in place so you can resolve those triggers ahead of time. Okay, we talked about the window of tolerance. If you have any questions, let me know on this in the chat, but I don't want to revisit it unless we need to. The last thing I want to mention is that we are also offering free coaching sessions to anybody who's interested. This is a QR code. You can either take a screenshot of this or just scan it with your phone if you'd like. We're going to offer free coaching sessions for anyone that's interested to work through some of these things or to talk about anything that's relevant for you in your role. This is my email address as well for those of you who didn't get it in the chat. And if you want to know more about coaching at Lawyerist specifically, this is our URL to learn about just how does our coaching work and some of our other coaches that are here at Lawyerist as well as at Affinity.